Okay, so this is part two, obviously picks up where part one left off, kind of around World War One. We're going to go through the interwar period, learn about Spain, what happened there, pretty amazing around Barcelona, all the way, of course, through World War Two, and then the hippie movement post-World War Two, the punk movement with a little revival with Reagan and Thatcherism, neoliberalism, and a pushback to kind of where we are today. So we'll see how we can kind of track anarchist thoughts. So enjoy. This is part two with Ruth Kinna. If I had known anything about anarchists besides, the punk rock kids and anarchy in the UK stuff that I got growing up, it was that they blew a lot of stuff up around this time, banks and whatnot. If I'm not mistaken, was it in New York Harbor when one of the largest bombs went off by a supposed anarchist? I don't know if I'm even getting these dates right, but in my head, it's early 1900s. And it's a lot of activity in and around American cities with supposed anarchists blowing stuff up and assassinating people. What was going on there, and what maybe intellectual ideas were animating them that we've already mentioned or haven't mentioned yet?
So it's a complicated history, but there is a sort of the history of anarchist violence, if you like, is often tied to this idea called propaganda by the deed. And that's, and in some ways, there was this current of thought within anarchist movements that one of the ways in which you could attack or counterattack the violence of the state, if you like, was by targeting some of the leaders of regimes, or eventually actually just bombing in public places. The concept itself, propaganda by the deed, is coined before it becomes associated with terrorism. So it's coined in the 1870s, and it has a Republican root. But it's used by anarchists just to think about how you can draw attention to anarchist thinking alongside just written text and pamphlets and newspapers. And so they think about sort of staging confrontational actions, so actions which will demonstrate to a wider audience that what anarchists are saying about the restriction of liberties and the violence that's used habitually, to quell dissent, is actually, they enact this. This is how it starts. What happens, of course, is that propaganda by the deed becomes linked with defensive actions. So some of the anarchists in America, in Chicago in the 1880s, who are faced with incredible degrees of vigilante violence and employer violence. So, you find during strikes that employers or bosses will bring out armed strike breakers against them, and workers are shot. And one of the reactions to this is to arm the workers. So rather than just stand there and be shot, you're going to fire back. And this is how the kind of the cycles of violence take over. It's also true that in the 1890s, I suppose it reaches its height, the early 1890s in Europe, in France and in Spain in particular, there are cycles of violence which are stimulated by, again, often by strikes where workers have been killed, or by imprisonments, and individual anarchists, many of whom are sons of communards, i.e. people who have been involved with the commune, who are already deeply radicalized, take it upon themselves to assassinate heads of state.
Yeah.
So there is a whole spate of killings. And of course, this creates a kind of an image of an anarchist terrorist. But it also provokes a huge debate within the anarchist movement about the wisdom of violence and the possibilities of transformation through violence. And in the American context, at the turn of the century, there are a group of, they're Italian heritage activists. They're organized around Paterson, New Jersey. They take the lead in this. And they do get involved in a bombing campaign. But then this is, a lot of this is in the context of, the Red Scare, mass deportations, and, systematic, persistent violence against members of their communities. So Italians are, racialized, they're, discriminated against. And so this is a kind of a counterattack, if you like.
Yeah.
But it creates a lot of, as I say, debate, opposition within anarchist ranks, although anarchists are careful about denouncing each other in public. I mean, it causes disquiet. So there are divisions within the movement about this. It would be wrong to say that all anarchists are involved in this, but equally it'd be wrong to say that the anarchists who are involved in it were mindless. This was a strategic move. It might have been, we can judge it as we like, but this was a response to what they saw around them.
Yeah. So World War One, then. I don't know if there's any. I also want to put out. I watched a lot of your talks, and I was reading some of your work. I also want to put out. I don't know where it fits into the story, but some of the really beautiful poetry and sort of utopian dreaming that happens throughout these movements. We've been talking about it a lot as in sort of an antagonistic or labor against ownership, but there's a whole, of course, stream of the entire anarchist conversation that is very floaty and dreamy and beautiful and playful, like I said, that feels very different than bombing New York Harbor or blowing up a bank or whatever they're doing. And I'm not sure where and how to weave those through, but you're so good at bringing those to surface that I want to make sure that we sprinkle a little bit of that in for people who are interested.
No, I mean, that's very true. So anarchism, I mean, there's always been a significant sort of cultural and literary dimension and visual arts, involved in anarchism. So a lot of the impressionists are involved in anarchist movements. They're inspired by anarchist writings. I mean, there's a whole idea of, I suppose, a kind of a better world to come. A lot of literature which looks at reversing. Or sort of pointing up the dystopia that we live in order to promote actually the possibility of just living better. So a lot of the ideas that are communicated through this kind of literature are ideas of harmony, of love, of sometimes the implication of a kind of perpetual peace. I think that's sometimes misread, but certainly the idea that in the end, if you can remove the things that artificially divide us, then actually we're sociable people. And we want to bring out the best in each other. I mean, the whole point of this is to enable everybody to flourish, because we all benefit from that.
There was that lovely, the reference. I forget who it was. Was he describing London or something in that dystopian sense of like walking through, or maybe he was doing it the other way. He was like imagining walking through London and like the water was clean and the air was breathable. Do you know the thing I'm thinking?
Oh, right. So this is William Morris. This sounds like William Morris news from nowhere.
Give me some William Morris. What are his dates and where does he fit in? I know you know a lot about him. You've written a lot about him.
Morris is a British socialist who makes it actually. He comes from a very privileged background. He established himself actually first as a poet and a writer in the 1860s. He becomes linked to to people like Dante Gabriel Rossetti, so to the pre-Raphaelite movement. He's sort of latter part of the pre-Raphaelite movement. So this is a sort of a movement that's interested in returning to the sort of the simplicity of handmade art and craft. And from there, he takes this idea of artistic production and uses it as a way to criticize what he sees as the sort of the dirty, dull, mass-produced, manufactured tact of industrial Britain. And this leads him into a more general critique of commerce. He joins the socialist movement when it starts up in the early 1880s in London. He's introduced to Marx's writings. He says he struggles with Marx's theory, but he seems to have a pretty good grasp of it to me. but he doesn't like the politics of social democracy or Marxism at the time. He doesn't like the idea of party political organization. He doesn't like the idea of electoral competition. And so he kind of veers towards the anarchists without ever calling himself one. But he's a friend of Kropotkin. He knows Kropotkin. They spend time together. He admires Kropotkin, and I think Kropotkin learns a lot from him. And towards the end of his life, he writes this book called News from Nowhere, which interestingly starts off with a conversation where he imagines this conversation with anarchists, a group of anarchists, about what would the future look like. And he then sort of, the narrator of News from Nowhere falls into this deep dream in Hammersmith, which is in West London, where Morris lived. And he wakes up from this dream and he's been transported to this future in the 2000s. And he can't believe what he sees, because he looks at the Thames just outside his house, and he sees that the horrible industrial iron bridge has been replaced with this beautiful brick structure. He takes a walk across the bridge. He bumps into this guy, and he says, where am I? He has this conversation. He says, because he smokes, he says, you haven't got, where can I get something to smoke? And this guy gives him a pipe. It's beautifully crafted. It's handmade. He fills it with tobacco. He just gives it to him. He wants no money. This is a place where there's no money, no property, no government. And eventually what happens in News from Nowhere is that the dreamer meets someone who has a memory of, or has a knowledge of the history of the 19th century. And they have this conversation about how things were in Victorian times compared to how things are now. And through this dialogue, you get a sense of how the transition came, which was through syndicalist action, through union action. And you get a sense of how particularly labour has been transformed from something that you do as a compulsory activity that you take absolutely no joy from, into something that is an artistic activity in which you invest yourself. And this is the basis of your new artistic economy. Yeah, it's a fantastic book.
Yeah, I just wanted to throw that out there. And at the end, I might have you give a bunch of recommendations for more of that kind of stuff, because it's also just really beautiful, the poetry, and I've heard you read some of that now. But all right, so let's go through World War I. I'm not sure if there was interesting anarchist activity or thought happening at that exact moment, but then maybe into the wake of it. I want to try to get eventually to what happened in Spain as a huge, I don't know if you modern success for at least a degree, a really interesting test case. But I don't know if I'm missing something in that World War I period that's worth letting people know.
I mean, there's the Russian Revolution, which is
that little thing. Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, World War I is a disaster for anarchists. The movement splits because Kropotkin in particular decides that the German invasion of Belgium is an act of domination to which everybody should respond by resisting. So he sees the invasion of Belgium triggers the Treaty of London, which was made in 1839, which commits the British government to defending Belgium. And rather than say the British government, that anarchists should have no part in this capitalist war, Kropotkin says actually it would be an act of mutual aid to defend Belgium against Germany. The majority of the anarchist movement are profoundly shocked by what he has to say, and pretty much disown him and say that he's compromised his principles, and become, their anti-militarism is expressed as a refusal to take sides and instead to promote revolution rather than get involved in what they see as something which is fundamentally disastrous for all people who are involved in it. This is just going to be mass slaughter, which of course it turns out to be.
Yeah. Can I pause and ask you a personal question there, someone who studies all this? Because it seems to me, just to put World War I in context there, and this will relate to our modern world, but we haven't mentioned the word colonialism yet, but this
No.
is, everything we talked about in that period up until right now is the steady expansion march of a colonial world. In World War One is maybe the first, massive clash of the colonizers just bumping into each other, not having any room, and all throwing a mutual giant tantrum. The historian Roy Casagrande, who I really like a lot, talks about World War One being like there was no good guys; it's just all bad guys. It's like the great, it's just a whole bunch of bullies in the room who got too big, who started fighting with each other. So it is surprising. I mean, I'm asking you now with maybe the clarity, if there is any, of hindsight. It does seem like Kropotkin really missed the boat there of taking sides in that. I don't know. That's how it strikes me as maybe that you're right, like a disaster for the anarchist movement there. Why did he make that? Maybe it's presumptuous. Why did he make that mistake in thinking?
So, I mean, just on the point of colonization. So, yeah. Anarchists are profoundly anti-colonial, right, anti-imperialist, but they come at it from a particular perspective. So they see statism as a colonizing process.
Right. So you're saying like even just
start yet. So right. So instead of thinking of, we have these European powers, and then what they did was sort of colonize non-European worlds, they see the whole process as being partly continuous. So there are power asymmetries in this. So the Europeans clearly were the dominant force, and they imposed their culture, right, they imposed their civilization theses, they were racists. Everything was heaped on the non-European world. But the process itself was something that had happened already within the boundaries of, right, these European states. So if you want to talk to, people in Ireland or people in Wales or people in Scotland about colonizing processes, they're going to talk about England.
Yeah.
This was the process that started. This was the process of homogenizing, of territorializing, of bordering. And of enforcing people to adopt a certain pattern of accept a certain system of government. So, Kropotkin, is one of those people who sees the state as a colonizing move. What he sees in Europe, I guess it's a different register. Or a different sort of level of analysis. So he sees the conflict between France and Germany, which essentially is what it is, the First World War. He sees this coming from probably 1902. He thinks it's inevitable. And he thinks actually by that point, the anarchist movement has probably lost out to social democracy, that actually they've lost the argument with the workers. The workers are actually much more interested in getting the vote in electoral competition. So he's not going to give up, but he thinks that they're on the back foot.
Yeah.
There are still mass workers' movements, but he's not confident that anarchism has really gained traction. And then he looks at Europe and he sees these empires. He sees the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And he thinks about, well, what's going to happen when this blows up in war? What's the post-war constitution going to look like? Is it going to look like more centralized states? Or is there a possibility that we could reconstitutionalize by federalizing some of these empires? Mm-hmm. So he looks at Russia and says the best outcome for Russia would be the breakup of the empire and the federal union of its component parts. Mm. And the same in Austria-Hungary. What he fears is that, the miscalculation I think he makes is that he thinks that the victory of Germany is going to make the centralization of these empires more certain than the victory of France will. But I think the reason that he calls it the way he does is because he thinks there's a possibility of reconstitutionalizing along federal lines in Europe.
Okay.
At least and what he most dramatically, fears is a kind of is the Bolshevik takeover what he thinks of the Jacobin takeover of Russia, which is what happened.
Which is what happened, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And he sees nothing revolutionary in this, absolutely nothing.
Right.
And interestingly, he is in that sense he's ahead of the curve, because at the time of 1917, when Lenin pulls off the coup. Emma Goldman, admittedly from some distance from things, but then Kropotkin's at some distance too, she thinks that this is a revolutionary moment. He never thinks that.
Okay, so now we're really splintering things here, right? But so Russia, World War One ends, Leninism.
Yeah, Lenin.
Has,
So socialism. So the main ground of socialism is then taken by the Marxists.
yeah,
Lenin calls rechristened social democracy communism.
yeah,
Reforms the international under Bolshevik rule. So the socialist parties or communist parties across the world are given a choice of either aligning with the Bolsheviks or not, and most of them actually do, even if they have qualms about it. And anarchism is then pretty much eclipsed
yeah,
intellectually and in terms of its organizational strength, because you've got a world which has been devastated by war. You've got a mass, thousands, millions of people dead, and you now have the center of gravity moving towards a movement that is completely opposed to you.
yeah. So we'll let
It's not
Russia,
good.
yeah, we'll let Russia do what it does, call itself what it calls itself. I think it's fair to say that has really nothing to do at this point with anarchism. Maybe a certain interpretation of Marx, which we could argue about all day, whether it's legit or not, but they're off doing their thing, thinking that it's a workers' revolution, but really it might just be a nightmare disguised with a new elite class of of vitriol.
Yeah.
But that's happening there. And in Europe is in shambles. I'm not sure what's really happening in America, but where and when? So where is anarchism then? If it's sort of as maybe a global conversation has crumbled at that point to a significant degree, it still was existing in little pockets. And I'm trying to get to what happened in places like Spain, as like it still very much refines. These ideas don't go away. These ideas
no, they don't. The ideas don't go away, nor do the
Yeah.
movements. So, because in America you have the Red Scare, and you have, as I say, these mass deportations and considerable anxiety and repression of anarchist movements.
Yeah.
Anarchism is completely outlawed. But I mean, you have anarchist movements that are active in Latin America.
Yeah.
You have anarchist movements that are developing in. Certainly anarchists gain traction in places like China.
Yeah.
You have, in the interwar period, you have anarchists that are involved in syndicalist movements in Germany, for example. So there are still these mass movements, and actually one of the other results, I suppose, of the First World War is that you have a non-violent pacifist movement beginning to gain traction within anarchism and also through anarchism into other pacifist movements. So there is a long-term influence of Tolstoyanism, for example, which reaches far beyond anarchism into Gandhi, ultimately to people like Martin Luther King. So anarchism certainly doesn't go away.
Yeah.
But in Spain, I suppose, Spain has had a powerful anarchist movement. It's been organizing for a long, long time. And it's been incredibly successful through its union, the CNT. And the particular conditions of Spain, I suppose, play very well to anarchism. So you have, centers of concentrated industrial force where you've got large union organizations which are basically anarchist. They're run by anarchists. They are the most significant power. And then you've got vast areas of rural agriculture, where the land is owned by these very, very rich and very brutal landowners, and where you have a huge alienated rural workforce, which is completely disaffected with government, and which has been consistently disappointed, if you like, by in the 20s and 30s by the brief periods of Republican rule, which have failed to basically reform land ownership. And what happens in Spain in 1936? I mean, there's been a period of long instability because there's been sort of polarization with shifts of government between Republicans and conservatives. And as a result of this, I mean, the army has traditionally been the sort of the arbiter of power in Spain for many, many years. I mean, throughout the 19th century, right up into the 30s. And in 1936, General Franco stages a coup, which fails. So it's supposed to topple, supposed to take power across the whole of the country, but it doesn't. He manages to get. I mean, Hitler helps him. He flies out the army of the North from Morocco into Spain, and they manage to secure about half of the country, but the other half of the country sort of is basically rises up. I mean, these are just local people who are organizing themselves in militia to resist the coup. Yeah. And it's not clear in that population how many of those people are going to fight for the republic and how many of them are actually trying to run the revolution, trying to declare a revolution. But there are significant numbers who think of themselves as anarchists who are not really interested in saving the Republican government. What they're interested in is defeating the Franco's rebels, in order to see through an anarchist transformation. And so you've got these three sort of centers of power, I suppose, or players who are involved in Spain: Franco, the Republicans, and then the Popular Revolution. And of course, what happens in Spain is that the complications of international power then have their effect, because Franco is backed by Mussolini and Hitler, and they arm him, and the Luftwaffe are playing with their kit and doing blanket bombings in the cities. France and Britain, who in principle should be backing the Republican government as liberal democracies, are squeamish about annoying Hitler and Mussolini. So they decide that they're not going to intervene. The only power that intervenes on behalf of the Republic is Stalin. And Stalin is fundamentally opposed to the anarchist revolution. So the way that it plays out in Spain, and particularly in Barcelona, which is the anarchist stronghold, I suppose, and in the rural hinterland, the way it plays out is that as the Republic receives support from Stalin, it actually tries to take control of these anarchist revolutionary forces, and it ends up in a kind of civil war within a civil war. With Republicans fighting anarchists or Stalinist-backed Republicans fighting anarchists.
But in that little Barcelona world, there were these. I mean, I live in Spain now, so I hear them. There was these pockets of success, and there's a lot of nostalgia for these. Yeah, apps like lots of people here. Not in Madrid, where I happen to live, but lots of people in Spain absolutely are sure anarchy works and functions just fine. There's actually less of a stigma against it because there is this direct experience. I mean, there's these wonderful books written about these moments and these periods there where people were cooperating, didn't need a government to tell them to get up in the morning.
Indeed. I mean, I think for me, the argument about, can people cooperate? Yes. I mean, I just don't think that's what Spain demonstrated, I suppose, what Barcelona demonstrated for all of the problems that it had. Nothing works perfectly, but then, show me a government that does. It managed to run a wartime economy. On anarchist lines, and actually one of the things that you also find is not just in the city of Barcelona, where you have all kinds of eyewitness testimony about the way that the industry was run, but also the transformation of social relationships. I mean, small things perhaps, but Orwell reports in Homage to Catalonia, tipping was abolished. People felt themselves as being equal now. There was respect. There was a kind of an understanding of that the old ways were really not going to be replicated. So there's a real social transformation, but also in the rural areas. I mean, you have people have been working under horrendous conditions, not being educated, not having services provided for them, in local villages and communes. And and they're perfectly able
Yeah.
to run their local agricultural economies and collectivize and work out how they're going to do this by themselves. Some of them actually develop written constitutions, and one of the first things that happens in these rural communes is they conduct a land survey, and they decide how they're going to organize the land, how much is going to be collectively owned, and how much, down to the number of chickens you can have, how much is going to be individually owned.
Yeah.
And these are agreements that people make. And not only do they manage to feed the militias, the anarchist militias, and provide the cities with food, they also set up the first welfare systems in their communities. They normally take over the churches. One of the first things they do. They provide healthcare. They set up cinemas. They set up schools. They set up institutions that they would like to have,
Yeah. Yeah.
and that were always denied to them by the people who controlled the land that they were forced to work.
Yeah.
So this was to call it an experiment, this was a demonstration, if you like,
right,
of the way that aspiration played out in practice in a horrendous situation of war, and was eventually also crushed.
Yeah.
But this was, if you want a sort of documented proof, as it were, of people being able to run their own institutions and come to their own systems of self-government, devise their own systems of self-government, then Spain was it.
Yeah, amazing. And then, dragging through. Thank you for your time, by the way. I don't know.
It's a pleasure.
This is absolutely amazing, and just I can't wait to rewatch it myself. I'll probably release it in 2 parts, just because it's going to be long for YouTube. But then we have World War II. I don't know if World War II much was happening directly in it. I mean, when these wars happen, it's like, what can you really say other than just try to survive and get through? Of course, there's plenty of imagination and creative destruction, where you can suddenly imagine what might come next. The destructive power demonstrated by human technology in World War II, I think, was a bit of also a game changer. I always think way back to our maybe the more philosophical conversation about Hobbes. It's like, well, if that technology exists, the theory of the Leviathan gets a little bit more attractive. But it's ironic because it's like, well, the system created the destruction thing itself. And then, you have to be afraid of the thing that it made itself in order for then it to convince you that it can save it from itself. But whatever that is, I think there probably was interesting anarchist thought in World War II or during World War II, and that maybe got a little catch on post World War II because we maybe there was a feeling like we just can't go through that again. Like, we can't have a World War III. If this is what sort of capitalist systems have led to, can we imagine something different? Am I reading that a bit wrong? I mean, the word anarchy, I imagine, gets a little bit more energy and influx in the 50s and then in the 60s with counterculture movements, whatever those are. And you could tell me about those. But it seems that in World War II itself, or the immediate aftermath, there would be some anarchist writing or dreaming that would get attention because people must have been so horrified and fed up with what we got ourselves into with these states and governments in the system.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, for me, one of the most interesting people, or one of the most interesting sort of currents of ideas that come out from the development of nuclear technology and this appalling kind of demonstration of killing, are people like Alex Comfort on the one hand, who begins to think about the state, and also, of course, also the Holocaust and the kind of the problem of explaining why it is that ordinary people get sucked into systematic killing. So I mean, this is a question that Tolstoy asks in War and Peace. Why do people kill? Why do people fight? But it becomes, in World War II, this idea, I suppose, post-Nuremberg, that, people were sort of saying, well, actually, I was just doing what I was told.
Right. It's the Hannah
So
Arendt.
this,
Yeah.
yes, so I'm just obeying orders. I didn't do anything wrong. I was just obeying orders. And this kind of, it bears out, if you like, the idea of the irresponsibility that authority breeds, which is one of the things that's at the heart, I think, of the anarchist critique of Hobbes.
Hmm.
That if you keep telling people that they have to do what they're told to do, then ultimately what they will do is become completely irresponsible with it. They won't either they won't make the judgment or they'll say they can't make the judgment. But one way or another, people will detach themselves from actually moral responsibility
Yeah.
of doing things. So this sort of brings, I mean, World War II really brings this to the fore. And Alex Comfort is one of the people who starts writing about the state as a delinquent.
Hmm.
So this is the ultimate delinquency.
Yeah.
And the result of this kind of delinquent behavior is the death wish that the state seems to have demonstrated. And you can make the same argument. I mean, and I think anarchists do now, by hooking it to ecological destruction as well.
Yeah.
But actually, what's going on here is not a critique of, I mean, in some cases it can be a critique of technology, but it's, I think, actually a critique of the ways in which creativity and invention and, sort of just, or sort of ambition, if you like, in
Hmm.
many ways, is always co-opted for harmful use.
Yeah.
And we can't escape that in the systems of organization that we've created. So, and this was the dilemma, if you like, of the scientists who were involved in all of this physics. They can see the capacity of this, but they're not necessarily, I mean, some of them are, but not all of them, certainly. They're not necessarily thinking the only way we can apply this is in a bomb.
Yeah.
Why does that happen? And people like Comfort are saying, well, it's going to happen where you have systems which are geared towards competing and dominating.
Yeah.
And that's a state system. So we're in basically a system of death. So on the one hand, this is one train of thought that comes out of World War II, and I think it's incredibly powerful and important to us now. And on the other hand, you have people like Paul Goodman, who are active in America, who see the same kinds of destructive tendencies, if you like, in modern living, but who also sort of take this destructive tendency and say, okay, let's return to what a utopian prospect is. And let's think about how we can transform our environments, because if we don't start transforming our environments, there's no point at which you can say we're at the brink. We're going to fall over. At some point we're going to fall over.
Yeah. No, that's quite good. Yeah. I always think of it or as morality and moral integrity as a muscle that can atrophy. And the Hobbesian view of habitually handing over your decision making, your moral decision, what you do, what you purchase, what you think, what you can imagine is the worst part, right? To the Leviathan, and like you said, the deal was as long as it doesn't kill you, and but the irony of the Leviathan, like you walked through, was that it can kill you if you start imagining things that it doesn't like. But it's just going to make sure like war doesn't break out or whatever. It was failing on every front. But I think the explosion in the psychological experiments, the Milgram experiments and everything in post-World War II and all the conformity experiments. I'm a huge fan of Leon Festinger and his cognitive dissonance experiments and all that in the 50s, really scared the hell out of us about but there's two questions, kind of what you're putting on there about comfort is that who we are, or is that what we've become? Because of the Hobbesian shadow and the Leviathan, are we actually incredibly scary machines that can be manipulated and geared towards a fascist end to all become Nazis? Or is that a kind of programming that we've taken on because of the kind of systems and environments that we've so passively participated in since Hobbes? That's an open question, but I think it's one the anarchists have an answer to that we all hope is right, and I certainly adopt, is that no, that's not who we are. We're not just all Nazis in waiting. It's because we've lost the muscle is atrophied, but we can build strength again and to actually self-govern and take care of ourselves. And we better get going quick because look at those big bombs. I mean, that's my take on it. I don't know if that was
no, I think that's
thinkers.
right. So I think, anarchists, it's not entirely who we are, but it's something that we can become.
Yeah, we can become.
And it's something that we can become because of the way that we have, deep, meaningful social attachments to each other.
Yeah.
And these can be manipulated.
Yeah.
So so we will fight for things we love. The problem is that we don't always reflect on what it is we love. And if we're told it's our country, right or wrong, then that's a problem.
Yeah.
And there's something about, that anecdote about, Lenin used to refuse to listen to Beethoven because it would make him soft.
Poor guy.
Yeah, but I think in the Solzhenitsyn book, Lenin in Zurich, I mean, he's sort of standing in front of patisseries saying, when the revolution comes, I'm going to destroy patisseries because their cakes are too delicious and I can't afford to buy them. It's this sort of weirdness in our psychology, and there's we're complex beings, and we can be motivated in different ways. We can be manipulated. We can be, as Tolstoy calls it, we're hypnotized sometimes.
Yeah.
But as you say, if we stop practicing judgment, if we stop practicing making decisions with each other, then it becomes much easier to regulate and order us in ways which are, in the end, destructive to ourselves.
Yeah, I think you said you like Eric Fromm, so I'll give a little quote of him here, because he was writing in the time that we're in, so I'm contemporary enough. He said something like, when we're talking about AI or robots or humans and human nature, he said it will be no great feat to make robots that act like humans when humans act like robots. And this was his fear of, like, you're changing the human, so this isn't actually that big of a but that's just a funny anecdote. Let's go to, but actually maybe Fromm makes it in his way here. I don't think he ever called himself an anarchist, but you could correct me if I'm wrong. But so marching it towards the great 60s and 70s and the hippie movement and the whatever was happening there, that's when maybe as an American, I just got a little bit more of it in the water of what was happening in Haight-Ashbury, San Francisco or whatever, or even Black Panther movements and civil rights movements. It seems anarchy, maybe not by name, although maybe it was fashionable enough at that time to use the A and the graffiti again at that point, I'm not sure, starts making its way into the conversation in a meaningful way again that I'm familiar with. So what's happening in the 60s and the free love movement?
So I think, in terms of the politics of it, as you say, there's a whole swathe of different kinds of currents of ideas. I mean, including some ecological ideas that are coming into currency, feminism, anti-racist movements, and I guess a lot of this politics isn't well captured by the communist parties.
Yeah.
So in Europe, the socialist left is kind of dominated by communist parties. I mean, that's, one stripe or another, or Marxist parties. And Marxism has become very, very narrowly sort of linked to class politics and class war. And it doesn't speak to these other kinds of oppositions. And I think there's a sort of certainly in France, which has a huge influence on the way that the sort of the new left develops. When the students come out on the streets, they're not coming out. I mean, the Communist Party are against them. So they're kind of called anarchist or anarchistic simply because they're on the left and they're not following the party line. But of course, that then I think probably galvanizes. I mean, certainly people like Danny Cohn-Bendit. He starts rediscovering the anarchists. He reads Proudhon, he reads Kropotkin, and he starts talking about these ideas again. And suddenly there's this whole blossoming of people going back to a literature that they'd never heard of, and finding some resonances from 19th century anarchism into 20th century anti-authoritarian politics. And you do have significant players. I mean, in America, Paul Goodman is one of those people. He's been knocking around since the 40s, but is discovered by the generation of the 60s as an anarchist who is able to sort of articulate the dissatisfaction, who gets involved in anti-Vietnam draft card burning, who sort of speaks to a different kind of way of thinking about living and social relationships, and brings anarchism into a movement that has simply never heard of it. And I think that's the sort of the birth of a new kind of way of thinking about what anarchism can mean. And of course, the people who get involved in this, the activists who get involved with it, do so from their own sort of context and with their own concerns, and that transforms the tradition too.
Yeah. So I don't know if we're missing something in the 60s and the 70s, but the anarchist movement, I imagine and again, I'm just thinking of my American imagination, a lot of communes and smaller communities are popping up in the 60s and experimenting, maybe the human potential movements and the Esalen Institute, and rejecting a lot of things. I don't know if it's fair to call that, is it fair to call those movements anarchist in spirit, or I'm not sure.
So I think so. One of the hangovers of the Second World War is that you do have a rebirth of an anti-authoritarian movement,
right?
Because anti-authoritarianism, is one of the points of contact.
Yeah.
I mean, not only historically, because before anarchists actually called themselves anarchists, they called themselves anti-authoritarian, but because one of the things that anarchists, I mean, certainly people like Kropotkin want to argue, is that, anarchism is a particular expression of an anti-authoritarian sentiment at a particular historical moment. So you should expect to find anti-authoritarian movements all the time, everywhere.
Right.
But they're not necessarily going to call themselves anarchists.
Fair. Okay.
And in this sense, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, it doesn't. So maybe the better way to ask about this period then is actually about the backdrop of what happened with this word communism, because that seems to have been dominated. Because I'll bring us up to maybe, the Cold War and the fall of the Soviet Union or whatever. But what happened with this word communism in that period that became maybe unfairly there by American right-wingers labeled as, atheist, anarchist, devil worshippers or whatever. All the slander that got thrown on Soviet-style communism, anarchism seems to have taken a hit, at least publicly, by, getting thrown in that direction. I think if you brought up the word anarchy in a lot of conservative circles in America, they would just immediately associate it with some sort of evil Russian Cold War nonsense.
Yeah. So I mean, it all gets wrapped up, into Sovietism. I mean, the label communism is Lenin uses it in 1917 to rebrand his version of Marxism. Yeah. So he calls himself a communist, and he calls the international a communist international. So thereafter, so at the point at which you've got the origins of Cold War politics in 1917. It's an anti-communist politics before Stalin, but communism becomes Sovietism. Yeah. Eventually, and as I think from the conservative, small c conservative American point of view, these people are all Reds. Yeah. They're all Reds. And they're all Russians. What is that? And so we don't have to distinguish really too carefully between.
But I want you to communist to Sovietism. What is that shift in your eyes? Is communism 1917 about just workers owning the factory and reorganizing who's at top of the class? But then Soviet. What is that shift? Communism to Sovietism.
So I think it's an institutional development. That's how I see it. But communism is. William Morris called himself a communist when no one was calling themselves a communist, apart from the anarchists who call themselves anarchist communists. Okay. So, but it becomes from being understood in the 19th century anarchist context as a kind of an institutional underpinning for a propertyless, egalitarian system of self-government. It becomes adopted by Lenin to describe the affiliation to a particular set of doctrines, or what he calls the 21 points. And once the institution of the Soviet Communist Party is set up, and that takes, I mean, the period of revolution is, quite a long one. So we're talking about quite a long development in which, Lenin dies in 24. And then you've got the struggle between Trotsky and Stalin. But communist has been established as the label.
Yeah.
As the institutions develop through Stalin, it is Stalinized. And Soviet, which initially, it's a bit of a mess, just describes a system of workers' organization, also gets sucked into this institutional framing in which there is no autonomy left for the Soviets. Everything is going to be controlled by the Communist Party, which is under the rule of Stalin. Yeah. This has nothing to do with anarchism.
Nothing to do with anarchy, right? Yeah.
It has very little to do with many other forms of Marxism, but it becomes, because of the way that Cold War politics plays out after the Second World War, it becomes the model of Marxism, communism, socialism. Everything gets wrapped up in this what actually existing model. I mean, that's what it used to be called. And anarchism is a kind of a historical casualty of that move, because they were all from the same place, right?
Yeah. This seems like a real tragedy of ideas that happened there, that took a lot of things down with it. So that's happening, but eventually it falls, and it falls in the in the 80s. And I don't know. So I was born in 1982. Now we're getting to my contemporary. I might remember some of this stuff. I don't remember hearing the word anarchy or anarchist thought, certainly not in any schooling I had. And again, if I did, I would have associated it with something silly and juvenile, or maybe even some Russian wacky idea that I'm just supposed to dislike. But what was happening there? Now we're getting to sort of the modern era of anarchist thought, which would probably eventually take us to today, because when the Soviets fall, or the Soviet Union falls, we have Ronald Reagan, and I think people are starting to, maybe rightfully, peg that moment, Ronald Reagan, as the start of what is being called neoliberalism, which has dominated the world, at least the American forefront of neoliberalism. So we're kind of in the modern conversation now, which, if you ask me, might be coming to a bit of a head with the way the world is going. So we could talk about this era almost as we're late in it. But 1980 till modern day, where is anarchy? What is anarchy?
There's been a huge cultural revival, which is through punk, right? So I mean, anarchism there are significant voices actually that we haven't thought about from the 60s onwards. So people like Murray Bookchin in America. So he's talking about social ecology. He has a profound influence not only in America but also in Europe too. And he comes out of 68 as a critic of Marx, as an anarchist, and so there's this, there are these sort of currents around. There is still an intellectual movement in Italy, and a workers' movement actually in Italy, France. There are solidarity movements that have been going on since the defeat of Spain, by anarchists. So that there is a current of ideas, but I suppose the big explosion, as you say, comes with Reaganism, Thatcherism, and that kind of dull, bossy, repressive politics that people associate with Margaret Thatcher, which comes out in a kind of youth rebellion and in punk. And some of this dissipates, into an aesthetic. But some of it doesn't, and actually it's there are many people who I know who were brought into the anarchist movement through punk, and who discovered not only the sort of the so-called classics, but who set up their own organizations globally. First off for sort of music sharing, but actually then as mutual aid societies. So you have this groundswell, I suppose, this mushrooming of DIY or do-it-yourself groups that are highly organized. You know, when computer technology sort of takes off, I mean, a lot of these people are also actually
Yeah.
pretty good at finding their way around the new net. So they're organizing online, they're making networks across the globe, and although it seems to come out of the blue, the sort of the neoliberal shift in politics, has its reaction in the auto-globalization movement. Now, again, this is a big complex movement, and a lot of these people are not anarchists, but some of them are, and its organizational practices look very anarchistic. So they become horizontal, leaderless, based on participation, do it yourself, anti-electoral. These are hallmarks of a movement which doesn't call itself anarchist, but which provides a vehicle, if you like, for a new kind of anarchism. And again, there's all sorts of publishing ventures that come out of this, which definitely promote anarchism. So I think there's it's easy to see these things coming in waves, and there being sort of silences or defeats. But actually, the organization movements don't work like that. I don't think they work through a lot of background organizing, and they become visible at particular moments in time. And Seattle and shutting down the World Trade Center was one of those moments.
Yeah, yeah. I'm gonna bring you to those because yeah, I mean the punk thing is so fun and so great. I love music, and so I think there's like we didn't talk about sort of the expression a lot of anarchist thought and energy through art, but it makes total sense with punk. I mean, a lot of these bands, I'm gonna forget the name of the band. There's one of the famous early punk bands, like they didn't know how to play instruments, and they're like, we don't care, we're just gonna pick them up and figure it out and play. And it's like it was almost like a middle finger to like the very structured authoritarian. You have to go to Juilliard and learn how to play classical music, and if you want to get on the stage. And it was like, rocking the boat of we're not going to play by your rules. They're kind of a rebellion to it. So, and I have to put a shout out one of my favorite movies ever. I don't know if you've seen it. It's called SLC Punk. If not, you should see it. Salt Lake City Punk, great film, I think, with Matthew Lillard. Everyone should watch it. But that youth punk energy maybe is an artistic expression, like you said. There's a fashion element to it, and it's juvenile. I don't know how much serious philosophical thought was coming out of directly the punk movement. I'm sure there was punk philosophers, but the energy was there. And then there's these moments where it does show up, and I eventually want to go to Occupy and Occupy Wall Street, and people like David Graeber, who I bring up a lot in my conversation with Sophie. Scott Brown, we're both big fans. I was going to Occupy as kind of an observer on my bike every day. I happened to live in New York at the time, lightly participating and keeping my eye on it. I don't even know if I knew it was an anarchist thing, or if it's fair to call it an anarchist thing. But I guess I'm asking you, in the modern era, you mentioned Seattle shutting down the World Trade Center. There was the WTO protests. Where and how is anarchy, in your view, sort of entrenching itself in those ways? And then I guess, are there new ideas, or is it, like I'm doing, continually rediscovering the Proudhons, and we're actually just in the legacy always of discovering these thinkers? And are we pushing it forward at all? I don't know how to ask that question.
Yeah, I think we are. I mean, in a sense, I'm the wrong person to ask, because I have one foot rooted firmly in history of ideas. So
yeah, and you have a journal that's doing this very actively.
I'm just very drawn to that history. But I think, I don't think there's. I mean, I think being drawn to something, being drawn to the history doesn't make the history sacrosanct. I mean, that's the point. But I mean, the way I think about anarchism is that it is a tradition, and traditions are messy, and they develop in different ways through the interaction of theory and practice. And and people articulate. I mean, when they identify as something, they normally have a reason to do so, and often that comes from having read or thought about a practice which can be articulated in some way. You know, the ideas are, you know, it's difficult to take the ideas out of anarchism, and say it is only a practice.
Right.
I think it's more than that. I think it's a practice which is built around a tradition that we can trace back in time.
Yeah.
And I think what happens in these kind of glorious headline events, if you like, is that you know, people will go in lots of different directions, but they provide a sort of a focus again. And often it comes negatively. So, you know, one of the things that's said about the social justice movement is you're anarchists, you know, as if it's an accusation. And of course, you know, that helps people then think about, oh, well, what does that mean? Yeah, maybe exactly. I'll claim it back. Which is, you know, which is how, you know, the Provo's, the Dutch movement, the 60s movement in Amsterdam works. You know, someone said, oh, we're going to call you Provo's because you're just provocative. You're not constructive. You're just provocative. And they say, okay, we'll call ourselves Provo's. And this is the way that I think traditions develop, when people sort of identify with something, and then, you know, of course you reinterpret it. You can't. There's nothing to be faithful to. You take what you think resonates with you, and then there's a new phase. It's a new part of that tradition, right?
Yeah, that's beautiful. So then let's end it now with today and where you see it, because I think we'll take a look at our world. It's the year 2025. We had a year of elections last year that are, you know, think what you want of them all over the world. I've been on a series talking a lot about Israel and Palestine, and as potentially another rallying point. Of course, I grew up Jewish. I won't go through it all here, and I have a Zionist family that I'm working through and all this kind of stuff. But I've been trying to take that conversation as a meeting point that people are very energized about, I think, for good reason, particularly because of the injustice of what it is, but also for what it represents on a larger scale. And I've been trying to take whatever little audience I have gathered and energy on the street that we have about that and make it a, what do you say, headline event. It is a headline event. But maybe the whole world is right now. We have the climate disaster, everything else happening. And so as at the head of this conversation, and I think you agreed, predicting that there is a renewed, and probably much more to come, a renewed interest in anarchistic thought, whether people know that's what they're engaging in or not, or whether it gets a name and then they, like you said, decide, hey, am I? Let me investigate it and maybe discover that it's not so silly, not so juvenile, not just a bunch of punk kids with tattoos. It's actually a really interesting place to be and put your mind. That's kind of where I'm at the moment, where I'm like, oh, I don't even know what this thing is. Let me look into it. So where do you see it now and then in the future? I mean, do you think this is a moment for anarchy to resurface, have a fruitful conversation, and where will it go from here?
So I think it's always a time for anarchy. And
I want you a T-shirt with that with you. Always a time for anarchy, Ruth Kinna.
And I think there are a number of ways that you could see it blossoming, maybe. I mean, post-COVID mutual aid. So one of the things, for all of the disaster of COVID and the horror of it, actually one of the things that is still sort of taking people's attention is the number of mutual aid societies that were set up. No one organised these things. These were just from below, people helping each other, trying to make sure they were well, safe, provided for. These are not anarchists, but this is exactly what Kropotkin says is self-government. This is how it works. So I think there's interest in that. I think there's interest generally because of the predicament we're in. I mean, certainly in Europe, about what's the best form of defence. And what kind of relationships are going to make security actually for people? You know, is it through the existing infrastructures that we have, which seem to be either collapsing or being dismantled, or is it through some kind of other federal arrangements? What could we imagine in a sort of a macro kind of politics? So I think there are those kind of big constitutional questions that are there, and which prompt different ways of thinking. And I think there are movements. I mean, again, in my own context, and I think more generally in the European framework, this idea of devolving power. So we have devolved nations here. We actually talk about nations now, which is quite interesting. So we think about Wales and Scotland and Ireland, but we don't, Northern Ireland, we don't think about, and post-Brexit, this is certainly a live debate, but we don't really think about, well, where does Westminster sit in relation to England? But there is a sort of an idea of devolving power. There are movements towards directly elected mayors. So you have this idea that maybe politics isn't stable forever. Maybe there are different arrangements that you can think about making. And you have this argument being played out across, different parts of European states. So again, that kind of puts different ways of thinking about political relationships and political organization on the agenda. And then the final way, again, these are sort of, they come out of the sort of dark times, if you like. But I mean, the ongoing argument we have about how do you sustain an expensive welfare system at a national level or on national levels, because you have devolved power here. And again, there's a question about, well, maybe some of our welfare services would be better run if they weren't centrally controlled. Maybe we should think about, how we can deliver services to each other without the complications that we've invented through the creation of welfare states, or what Colin Moore called warfare states. So I think there's a lot of kind of thinking being prompted by the uncertainty that's been created about the sustainability of liberal democracy as a project, and the values that people want to defend in that project, but maybe thinking about different models in which those values could be enshrined or better protected.
Yeah. Well, that's good. I mean, I think we should end it there. We brought it to today and a little brainstorm on the future. If you have a journal where you do this, you literally, what's the journal called? It's a journal of...
So there's a journal, Anarchist Studies, which is a multidisciplinary, cross-disciplinary journal. It does history, politics, geography, philosophy, arts, all sorts. So there's a website for that. There's also a blog. So if people are interested in contributing sort of opinion pieces, then just Google Anarchist Studies blog and it'll come up, and there's a contact there.
I think that's fun. It's super lively and it's got me brainstorming. So what more could we ask? Well, thank you so much. This was really great. That was a long, but really, I think we kind of got through it in a way that brings us to today.